to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivanna and Sam.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials, the podcast that looks at all things going on that are transformational in the clinical trials context. And today's guest is someone who came to my attention via her prolific and insightful posting on social media. It's someone who I find to have a great perspective on lots of topics, but specifically today, she's going to be talking to us all about a true passion of hers, which is wicked problem solving. Before we get into the interview, a very quick disclaimer that everybody's opinions on this show are their own and are in no way representative of the companies and organizations that they work for. Okay, so without further ado, it's great to be able to say hello and to introduce you to Nechama Katan, the self-proclaimed wicked problem wizard. Welcome, Nechama, to the show. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Sam. It's great to be here.
Perfect. So, Nechama, we're going to dig into your background a little later on in the show, but let's get straight into this topic of wicked problem solving. And for the benefit of our listeners and myself and Ivanna, perhaps you can kick us off by outlining to our listeners what is a wicked problem and why are they so prevalent in the life sciences industry?
So wicked problems have to be described in the context of complex problems. Complex problems, the classic example is a chess game. There's a lot of steps in a chess game. The rules are relatively straightforward and simple. Playing chess requires a huge amount of skill, but at the end of that game, you know if you won or you lost. The ending is non-ambiguous and very straightforward. Another example of a complex problem is clinical trial data submission. Lots of moving pieces, very hard to do it right, but it's very clear if you've submitted that trial successfully or you have not submitted that trial successfully. A wicked problem, by contrast, generally is not well understood. And in fact, it's so badly understood that key stakeholders will have a completely different view of what the problem is and often cannot come to alignment on even what the problem statement is, let alone the solution. Wicked problems, by contrast to complex problems that have clear stopping rules, are run out until you give up or quit or decide you're good enough. And so your solution is wherever you stopped. In life sciences, we have a number of wicked problems now. COVID has increased the pace of clinical trial work by orders of magnitude. And you cannot take a complex problem and then just simply speed it up in any sustainable way. The COVID trials were achieved by very large numbers of people working extremely long hours with very clear focus and very clear direction. This is not necessarily scalable to generalized clinical trials where we're literally not saving the world. So the wicked problem facing clinical trials right now is how do we transform from doing things the same way for the last 25 or 30 years? And to some extent, the people in leadership have been very well rewarded for doing things the way they've been doing. They're in leadership. And how do we transform from that model to a model now that can be done much faster in 1/10 of the time, 100th of the time, et cetera. And to do that, you need to pull everything apart and put it back together with different assumptions.
Fascinating stuff. And I would imagine for some people, the thought of wicked problem solving might be quite scary. From my perspective, I like to be able to box things neatly into boxes and have clearly defined boundaries. And based on what I heard from you there in that brief description of wicked problems, Nechama, doesn't sound like wicked problems necessarily conform to those kinds of limitations. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like I used to say, undergraduate education and a terminal master's in America all of the problems you face have answers in the back of the textbook. Those are complex problems. Wicked problems, there's no answers in the back of the textbook. And in fact, you're going to solve it once, and then the situation under which you would solve a similar problem will be completely different, and the answer will be completely different. They're one-off solutions. And yes, so if you've spent your entire life solving complex problems very well, it is very hard to make that shift to a wicked problem. To even admit that you have wicked problems, it can't be solved using the techniques you've been using for the last 10, 15, 20 years.
And is this term wicked problem something that's well accepted terminology, or is this something that Nechama Katan has created and branded yourself?
Absolutely not. So, I mean, I have not created and branded it. Wicked Problems came from a paper that was written, I believe, in the 80s called Wicked Problems and Social Complexity. PMI, the Project Management Institute, which is prominent in America, actually has a Wicked Problems sub-certification. So Wicked Problems have become very well accepted, and design thinking is kind of the corollary to Wicked Problems. And that's design thinking is a methodology used to solve wicked problems. And design thinking has been around since probably the 80s or 90s.
Got it.
As well.
Can I ask a follow-up question to the framework bit? Because within software development, especially now in life sciences, we orient ourselves in this Knebben model, where we have different stances of problems, and there are different kinds of solutions that go with these stances, where design thinking, according to that model, would belong in this complex domain where the only thing you can do is experiment like one step at a time. And once you've learned from that, then you can experiment some more and see where you end up. I was just curious if you would know if there's a relationship between this wicked problem terminology and the Knebben model.
I'm not familiar with that model, Ivanna, but what often happens is complex problems incorporate in most common language both what I call traditionally complex problems and wicked problems, which is what makes them so hard to solve, because people try to solve wicked problems by taming them, which means cut them up into a million little pieces and solve them as individual pieces. What you're describing with this try a step, see what happens, try a step, see what happens is a wicked problem way of solving wicked problems that happen to be complex, right? So this is part of the problem with wicked problems, as I said, is the key stakeholders generally don't agree on what the problem is. And in my experience, many of the key stakeholders don't accept that they have a wicked problem to begin with. They think they just have a complex problem that they can segment to death until it gets solved.
Yeah, that's probably where a lot of this analysis paralysis comes from in our industry, where you can look at the same thing in multiple different ways, but never really arrive at a conclusion.
Yes, and often what happens is that everyone in the room is using the same nouns to mean completely different things. And in some organizations, innovation happens at the speed of the meetings. So then what happens is you sit in a meeting, it takes 20 minutes to get everyone on board. You work for an hour, or if you're really organized, a 2-hour workshop. Then you stop working and you come back a week later. It takes you 20 minutes to get on board. And you can spend an enormous amount of time not moving forward because you can't ever get past the language. Language cannot be leveled. Complex language where people don't understand what's going on can't be leveled in large groups. You need psychological safety to solve these problems. And that means less than 5 people in a meeting, which is extremely rare in large corporations to have fewer than 5 people in a meeting, because everyone wants to make sure that they know what's going on.
Interesting stuff. Elaborate a bit further on that term, psychological safety, Nechama.
There was a TED Talk, I'd have to find the reference to it, that was given years and years ago, where a researcher who was doing design thinking went into a number of situations. So the first example that she gives is what happens to a nurse at 2:00 in the morning who sees a mistake or a likely mistake or something that's just not consistent on a patient's medication. who the last time she called the physician at 2:00 in the morning got completely reamed out and told that she was an idiot. The chances that she is going to call the attending physician to get a clarification on this possible mistake is very small.
Yeah.
She doesn't feel that she's got the power to say there's a problem. Google did a whole bunch of work on psychological safety. There's a number of questions. And if you Google psychological safety in the workplace, there's an assessment you can do. Do not do that assessment with your organization if you're not willing to change anything, because all you do is because otherwise you set yourself up in a bad situation. But it's pretty well established that if you have more than 5 or 6 people in a room, you do not have psychological safety, regardless of who those people are in the room. And we have all worked in organizations where if someone raises their hand and raises an objection, and they get basically told to go away, or that they're stupid, or that's not an objection, or I'm guessing you guys have had this happen to you. So those are all signs of lack of psychological safety in an environment. What happens then is mistakes happen in hospitals, mistakes happen in organizations, and people don't challenge when they see something is wrong, and you get the emperor has no clothes. And it's actually very, very hard to maintain psychological safety in an organization with multiple levels of hierarchy, because everyone wants to make themselves look good to manage. When you're managing up, you're by definition not, and you're not opening yourself up to an unsafe environment. You're saying what your boss wants to hear. And you're making sure the people underneath you are saying what your boss wants to hear.
And would you say that this is especially something that we observe in life science companies, or are we just like all other industries?
So I've worked in a lot of industries. I think so I worked briefly at a healthcare organization, one of the US West Coast large healthcare organizations. There was an interesting dynamic there because the doctors ran the organization, and then the doctors were the most senior people, and then the nurses, who were generally women, were the administrative management people. And when you put a bunch of men and a hierarchy on top of a very large group of women, that creates a very psychologically unsafe environment. And in some organizations in life sciences, there are certain types of roles that, like data cleaning, for example, that have predominantly been done by women. And life sciences does follow that MD model, right? The MDs and the PhDs rule, and they're disproportionately male.
Palmer, you alluded to the pandemic potentially being a little bit of a catalyst that's forced people to look at some of the wicked problems. Maybe you could just extrapolate out and give our listeners a couple of examples of types of wicked problems that maybe you're seeing, or people you're working with or have worked with in the past are seeing from the life sciences standpoint.
So COVID was the ultimate wicked problem. It absolutely was, right? You had, if you could imagine pulling a city council meeting together for a small town and having seated at that table your chief of hospitals, right? Your hospital representation, your small business representation, schools, public safety, and union employers, etc., right? All around that table in April of 2020, and said, okay, what do we do? So the health authorities said, well, we cannot overload our hospitals so that people who have heart attacks can't be seen. That was the reason for the shutdowns, was to avoid overloading the hospitals. Somewhere between April 2020 or March 2020 and 2021, 2022, the story went from we can't overload our hospitals to we can't allow anyone to die of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
This led to shutting down schools. And in America, the evidence is now pretty clear that 9-year-olds have had the biggest setback. We test kids at 9 for whatever reason, have had the biggest setback in their academic achievement ever since measuring it. Right? So at what cost did we save whose lives? There is no good answer. There is no good answer, right? Do we keep the businesses running so that people can get essential services? And even in the healthcare space, there's no good answer. The number of heart attacks that happened, the number of cancer diagnoses that were delayed. Everyone I know has an example of a friend who had a routine medical procedure that got canceled in those first few months that then led to a catastrophic problem later. So even in the medical situation, shutting down every society for COVID did not produce simple results. They produced, highly complicated dynamics. And so, yeah, nobody could agree on what the problem was. And we're not going to understand what the cost was probably for decades.
Do you think it's important that we always do have a clear definition of the problem, or do we have to, in these wicked problem scenarios, do we have to just accept that sometimes this is a moving target and you can't box things into these confines? Just curious on that.
So I actually think it's better to agree that we can't agree on what the problem is than to pick one version of the problem that nobody else agrees with.
Got it. Yeah.
So if everyone can come to the table and say, here's what my problem is, and Sam says, here's what his problem is, and Ivanna says, this is what her problem is, and we agree that those problems are, in some cases, mutually exclusive, that if I solve my problem, I break Ivanna's. If I can have empathy for the fact that the problem statement is a mess and is wicked, then we can come up with the best solution that doesn't break everybody all of the time. If we pick one because I'm in management and say, this is my problem, and everyone else's problem has to be aligned, then we won't solve the problem in any way that meets anyone's needs. Again, that's what we did. We focused COVID entirely on the healthcare solution and pretty much ignored everything else. We didn't even solve it right for healthcare.
Mm-hmm. No, it's really interesting because obviously from my experience, I sell enterprise software, and I think enterprise software is very difficult to truly define problem statements for, because to your point, one person's problem can be another person's solution and vice versa. So yeah, I can resonate with what you're
one person's problem is another person's livelihood.
Yeah, precisely.
Which doesn't get stated. So if everyone can say, hey, if you implement the if you feel safe enough to say, yes, I think the software would be great, but I'm going to be out of a job. Can you help me reskill? Then now we've got a solution. If instead we're going to implement that software, the other person knows they're going to be out of a job, there's no discussion of the elephant in the room. The organizational goo, the ability of it's like ballistic goo, it's just for organizations. The ability of an organization to stop progress because they feel threatened is unbelievable. It's absolutely unbelievable.
Got it. So, in terms of how you got into thinking about this as a concept, Nechama, I'm guessing you didn't just wake up one day and go, look, I want to start solving wicked problems. Give us a bit of the backstory of Nechama Katan and why you have such a passion about this particular topic and what led you to it.
Yeah, so my whole life has been one wicked problem after another. According to my family, I didn't speak until I was 4. But I have very early memories of asking very specific questions about the time my brother was born. So at 20 months, I remember asking whole sentence questions. I can tell you exactly what they were, and getting completely ridiculous answers. I now know, because they didn't think I was speaking, that they just were babbling back at me. I was like, well, okay, you don't make any sense. So I was being left in elevators. The first wicked problem I solved was I couldn't get out of an elevator fast enough. So I learned, again, 20 months, 22 months, to the minute the elevator door opened, look out at the pattern of the floor in a hotel to see what the carpet pattern was, because I knew I wasn't going to get out of the elevator fast enough. And then I would ride the elevator and probably saw that pattern again. What I didn't understand was the repeated floor patterns every 6 or 8 floors. And so if you're in a tall building, yeah, sure, you'd find that pattern again, but it wasn't necessarily the floor that you were supposed to be on. So I have spent my whole life, because of the learning disabilities and the autism traits, trying to figure out how to read. I test as someone who is technically illiterate, but I read a book or 2 a week, which I'm always posting about on LinkedIn. How to write, how to spell, and how to solve problems. So I got math degrees. I got 3 math degrees. I needed a job in Oregon at the time. The big employer was Intel. And so I called up hiring managers and said, do you need me? And they said, are you a process engineer? I said, no, but I can learn it, right? Mathematics is the ultimate liberal arts engineering degree. You can do nothing, but you can learn anything. And so eventually someone had a statistics job to put process control in at a factory. It turns out that the part of the factory that needed process control, really needed a golden metric, was a measurement system. And there was no way to apply process control without a golden measure. No one told me that. I beat my head against the problem for 5 years. I actually made some significant progress because no one told me it was an unsolvable problem. So I've been solving wicked problems for myself, for my family, for other people forever. And because I started having to solve problems at probably 20 years younger than most smart people don't have real problems until they enter the workforce. I just have a lot more experience than most people do.
Yep, experience counts, as they say.
There is a paper on wicked problems that I just got introduced to in, I want to say 13, 14 years ago, where someone who was an environmental engineer stood up and discussed the paper. And I thought, oh, that's what I do. And so I've been talking about it, as a formalized concept ever since.
Wow, no, that's amazing backstory, and really fascinating to hear what brought you into having such a strong opinion on this topic. Thinking about how you kind of sort of socialize this concept in a big organization, for example, I would imagine that there might be a viewpoint that this could be quite disruptive, and everybody likes to a lot of people like to go to work, do their job, log off, and forget about work. Then somebody comes along and talks about wicked problem solving, potentially puts people into a tailspin thing, and maybe even makes them feel insecure about what they're working on today. Is that a misinterpretation, Nechama? Or
well, it could be. It could be. So wicked problem solving comes with social complexity. Social complexity is understanding the framework of the person and the mindset of that frame of reference that person is looking through. So you don't come in and say, oh, this is a wicked problem. That never works. Same with design thinking. You never come in and say, oh, we need design thinking. If you're successful, then you can go back and say, oh, I use wicked problem solving. So generally, I just did a summary of my recent work history. I get brought in when there is a problem that they have attempted to solve with a normal person 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And those solutions haven't worked. And it's like, okay, let's bring in a Nechama. Right? So I usually get brought in for failed problems. At Xerox, my organization had agreed to pay $3 million for a dashboard that never launched for one small part of the organization, and I managed just for marketing, and I managed to extend it across 4 different working functions at a fraction of that cost. So I get brought in when organizations don't actually know how to solve a problem. I then solve the problem, and because I'm a failed salesperson, Sam, I have to tell everyone how I've solved it. Like if I get a trick that works, I'm like, oh, let me show you, right? If we all just talk together, we can do this. Let me show you how to do it so you also can do it. Some people appreciate that, some people don't. But yeah, the key to solving these problems is to understand what's driving the organization. And with that, what's driving them, what's going to make them allergic. I spent a lot of time on Zoom calls going, oh, whoops, that person's allergic. Let's back off, try another word. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try another word. Nope, that didn't work. I said process to the wrong person and they blew up. What do I do now? And you just keep renegotiating the language and redefining the language until everyone says, oh, okay, fine, I see what you're talking about.
And does this type of approach need strong senior exec sponsorship for it to fly, or is it down to the individual and their, I don't know, communication, jousting skills and influencing skills to be able to actually make something happen?
It would be amazing to have senior executive sponsorship on a regular basis. But even when I have had that, and I have been lucky enough to have that on occasion, senior sponsorship doesn't drive psychological safety and trust. It's, oh, now you're telling me I have to do it because I was told to do it by someone else. That's not necessarily helpful. So yeah, you end up with organizational jousting skills and leadership. If your senior executive sees what you're doing and values it, then it's way more fun, because now you're not selling to them, but you're always selling to your peers. That's, I think, the difference with wicked problem solving is that your focus is at your peer level and down. Yeah, you have to sell up, but if you don't sell it horizontally and down, it will never work.
And how would you categorize the kinds of maneuvers that you could take to attack some of these wicked problems?
Yeah, so the first thing is to really understand the language, and to, I think of problem solving is you walk into a room and you've got a peg of to hang coats on. So break the problem into some types of groups of pegs that you can go hang those problems on. It might end up being macrame where they all get woven back together at the bottom, but at least you can say, okay, this is this is that, this is the other. So I'm a system thinker. So the first thing I usually do is draw a picture of the system, and then I refine it. The other thing I find works really well is you go out 5-10 years, so far in the future that no one can actually argue with you. Draw a picture and then bring it back forward. Because if you try to argue about what's happening tomorrow, everyone's got an opinion, but no one really has thought through what goes out farther. And so you can usually drive opinions closer. Lots of one-on-one meetings, lots and lots of one-on-one meetings. Everyone has their trigger. Everyone has their thing that if you hit them wrong, they just shut down, and you need to be very aware of it. Because of the fact that I was such a poor communicator for the vast majority of my childhood, my grandmother told me she didn't understand me until I was 12. I've learned to over communicate. So in my case, it's, hey, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you please tell me that again? I'm new in the industry. Can you please tell me that again? Can you please explain your point of view again? And people tolerate it because I haven't been in the industry for 20 years and I legitimately don't know what I'm talking about. And they're more than willing to tell me. So in small groups. And so the trick is to pull this into small groups, because in large groups, people start jockeying for position and authority and power, irregardless of the problem or reason.
Well, I think we need to get you back into sales, Nechama, with those types of skills.
Well, thank you.
To be honest. What about like tangible outputs and results? Do people ever lose patience with this whole kind of concept of wicked problem solving and get impatient to start seeing the output and results? Because everybody wants to be able to measure what they're doing, and they want to be able to measure the impact yesterday. And to me, these types of things, they're organic. It sounds like they're quite organic, and potentially is a never-ending process in many respects.
Yeah, so there, what's really important, I think I've learned, is you focus on your goals. So identify what are the 2 or 3 things. I just picked up a new book called Living Your Best Year Ever by Darren Hardy. He's a sales guy. And he says, pick the 3 things at work or 3 things in your life that would make this the best year possible. So what are the 3 big problems that have to be solved? If you take that and you're really focused and you take that, let's say, problem, then you break it into monthly, quarterly, weekly, daily goals. You're making progress. My solutions, generally, people have failed multiple times at these problems over multiple years. It takes me 6 months, 3 to 6 months where people can start to see an impact. A reasonable person will see an impact of my work in an environment within 3 months. That's fast enough on a project that's failed for multiple years. Now, they all come back and say, well, what metrics are you going to measure with? I'm a metrics person. I started my business in process control doing metrics. I think that metrics are misused in organizations and goals are generally misused in organizations because people assign goals, they write them up on the performance review system, and they never look at them again until a month before the end of the measurement time, be it semester, quarter, year. And then they go back and say, oh, yeah, okay, fine, I did this, this, and this, and rewrite it, right? Really, or your boss comes in and says, you need to do this. And it's like, well, it's not one of my goals. Well, I'm sorry, grow up and do it. It's important. So that's a complete misuse of goals. And so I'm fine with being measured if we actually follow goals.
Got it. Because I
have a whole blog post around following goals as well, and other types of information like that, because we can get an enormous amount done if we're focused and we know what we're working on.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. And in my experience, to get buy-in for initiatives or projects, and for people to take time away from achieving their primary goals, if you like, they have to understand what goal it might be aligning to, and people are selfish as well. Everybody's altruistic in some sense, but often people look after themselves first, and they'll want to understand what's the impact to spending this time on this project, and how does that relate to me achieving my goals, both professionally and personally.
Yeah, let me give a different situation where this methodology does not work. If you're in a fee-for-service organization where you're basically getting paid daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly for producing a body of work, then paying a lot of money to someone like me to come in and innovate in this weird way that doesn't align with that fee-for-service becomes a challenge. That's when you need very senior leadership to support you, to say, oh, because I'm solving problems that are going to become critical in 5 years, and the organization is focused on getting paid next month.
Interesting.
And life sciences has a lot of fee-for-service organizations, internal and external to their organizations, right? Just because they haven't officially outsourced something doesn't mean that they haven't insourced with the fee-for-service model.
Totally agree. And something that I've seen you, I think, post about, or we've certainly talked about it before, is this concept of innovation moving at the speed of trust.
Yep.
Yeah. Can you unpack that concept a bit for us?
Yeah, so that's the other side of psychological safety. I've, just finished up, or I'm in the process of working on a project where I've spent 6 months building trust with someone, and they're a gatekeeper. So in the past, the conversations would be, I'm not comfortable with this. Please stop moving this forward until I understand exactly what's going on. And you go back to innovation at the speed of meetings, which do not happen very quickly, to a conversation that said, here's what I want to do. Okay, go do it. Come back and show it to us. And that allowed me to go off and come up with a solution that they could then, a straw man that they could then understand. So if you're spending all of your time trying to make people feel heard, or worse, spending all of your time ignoring other people and they're yelling at you because they're not feeling heard, or they're just simply stopping you because they're not feeling heard, then nothing happens. And so innovation, if you can build those relationships in an organization, it might seem like it's taken a lot of time initially, but it means that everyone then sits in a room, understands they're being felt, that they feel heard, that their viewpoints are being appreciated, that if they raise a concern, that they will be listened to. And then you can now move forward very, 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 very quickly, much, much faster than you would be going otherwise. And that's why I'm able to show value in organizations, is because once I've built that trust, then I can get teams to go very quickly.
Great.
And anytime you don't have that trust, then all you do is you escalate it up to senior management, you bring it back down. Every escalation takes 2 weeks. So now you're not even moving at the speed of meetings, you're moving at the speed of management escalation. And that escalation doesn't actually help you with anything, right? Because that person's just been told to listen to you. And they're not bought on. So if you need them to think differently or be creative, they're not going to do that because they're just there to be told to say yes.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating listening to you speak.
Innovation at Speed of Trust is a Stephen Covey Jr. book. It's not my frame. It's Stephen Covey Jr., great book.
But no, I think it's been a really fascinating conversation. I think when we strip it all back and look at what really kind of helps move the needle here, it boils down to some raw fundamentals of empathy, building trust, treating humans like human beings, and the type of soft skills that we sometimes take for granted. So yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and it's made me certainly reflect on my place in the workplace, and also this whole topic of wicked problem solving. As we start to draw to an end, we ask all of our guests the same final question, and that is, if there was one thing you could change about our industry, what would that be?
It would be trust. Our industry is built on the premise of lack of trust. It's been well earned. So the public doesn't trust the government and the public don't trust pharmaceutical companies because of mistakes that have happened in the past. You go through ICH and you see thalidomide, forced sterilizations. You see multiple bad decisions that were made. And that trust permeates all the way into our organizations. And if I could change one thing, it would be to go back and say, all right, if we could repaint this picture, what would it take to demonstrate trust by the healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry back to the public? And the COVID trial maybe moved that forward a little bit, but it's a huge ask. Mm-hmm. And show how we could actually partner with the public in a way that would allow us to then build external trust, which would create an environment where we could have much more internal trust than we currently have.
Great answer. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that as a fundamental change that would be positive for everyone.
It's a huge wicked problem.
It's a wicked problem, that's for sure. Listen, Nechama, where could our audience, who I'm sure are going to be really keen to reach out to you, to connect with you, to build on some of the discussion that we've had today, where can they best find you and connect with you?
LinkedIn. Nechama Katan in LinkedIn. My LinkedIn tag is just Nechama. I got in very early. And for my LinkedIn, I have a WordPress that you can click through and see some of the work I'm doing within productivity and goal-focused work.
Perfect.
It's a side of what I'm doing in the pharmaceutical space.
And you also involved in some charity work as well, Nechama?
So I'm heavily involved in the disability space.
Mm-hmm.
I have a child with a genetic diagnosis, as well as other children who have learning disabilities run in families. And so I spend a lot of time trying to show the world that we can value people based off what they bring to the table rather than trying to fix them to look normal. I'm never going to look normal. Trying to make me act normal on a complex problem just creates frustration and anger and lack of progress. Letting me go solve a wicked problem will move your organization forward. So that's true of most people. We spend a lot of time making them typical or normal. I hate the term normal, and filling in gaps that can't be filled in because I just don't have those skills, versus really focusing on what we do really, really well.
Awesome. well, hopefully this podcast can in some way help shine a light on some of the great work that you're doing and the organizations that you're helping to support. So
thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate your time, Nechama, and this is going to be a really great episode. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivanna Rosendal on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.